values, laws, science, and policy regarding those spirits' effect on the human spirit. So in Egypt, where hard liquor was first developed, it was a state secret. It was a state. Lots of other people had beer and wine technology. In fact, our word for alcohol comes from the Arabic alcohol, that means the essence. The idea being that there was a healing essence inside alcohol, the essence, and that if you could distill that healing essence and concentrate it, that's the idea behind distilled spirits. Now, in Egypt, the technology for alcohol, hard alcohol, distilled spirits, you required obviously metallurgy to make a still. So they could have made money from distilled spirits. They chose not to keep it among the royalty and trained medical practitioners. The common people never got hard spirits while Egypt existed as an internal African entity. What happened was, after they got conquered by the Romans and the Greeks, the technology of distilled spirits got into Western civilization without the cultural values of alcohol being replicated. So what I mean by that, hard spirits were basically not for public consumption, and no person in the public sphere knew about it. You had to be royalty or part of the medical field, and you dispensed hard liquor as part, either as an anesthetic or there are other medical reasons, but widespread drunkenness was not a part of their culture. And they kept it a state secret because they could understand that this would have a bad effect on the human spirit, and that's why they kept it a secret. Once they got conquered, the technology transfer that occurred with it going from an African context into a European context, the Europeans did not replicate the African values. So as I had told you on the first day, by 1600, you have the Puritans. First of all, you have hard spirits being made by Christian orders, like brandy and stuff like that. And you have the Puritans giving rum to 4-year-olds. Which didn't happen in Egypt. That would be crazy. In fact, the Native Americans on this continent, Turtle Island, that did have alcohol technology, that is the Aztecs and the East Coast tribes, the Algonquins and stuff like that, that did have beer and wine technology, only allowed beer and wine in a ceremony, only if you were adult, only if you were non-pregnant, okay, and not to intoxication. Right? So simply to induce a little buzz as part of the religious ceremony, but not getting sloshed. And in fact, some cultures like the Aztecs had fairly radical sanctions for being publicly drunk, including death, if you were a certain upper social strata, because you were considered a role model. Right? So Aztec, Native American culture did not have alcoholics until what happened with the Puritans bringing hard alcohol technology without the cultural protective factors and the values of the Egyptians, giving it to 4-year-olds. They're going to use fire water to induce native tribes to give up land and trade for land. Except that natives didn't, one, believe in real estate, and two, did also not believe, the ones that had alcohol technology, wouldn't do this, and the ones that didn't have alcohol technology had no defense against this. So it's basically like essentially introducing a non-drug using culture and giving them crack cocaine. They'll be instantly addicted and destroyed. And if you make a social policy that any Native American that prevents other Native Americans from drinking, if you subject them to arrest or murder, which actually was a policy of the United States government. So, for example, it was actually illegal to give Native Americans alcohol before 1952. Illegal. Federal law. But During the Indian Wars, the War Department, which was where the Bureau of Indian Affairs came from, Bureau of Indian Affairs agents, with the full knowledge of the U.S. Congress, illegally flooded native reservations with whiskey and hard liquor. That was illegal by federal law back then. They did it with the full knowledge of Congress with the intent that natives drink themselves to death. And anybody that objected was arrested or killed. So what happens when the people trying to prevent the problem are arrested or killed? So if you thought that when I said the first day, what if drug prevention was illegal? It already has been made illegal for certain populations at certain times as part of policy. So this overall concept of axiochemistry comes out of an African construct of we need to look at the history of the substance and how it affects us now, as well as economics and politics and spirituality. That each culture, with its drugs of choice, has certain cultural values around those substances that are native to those that got interrupted in the process of being American, which basically gave us an addictive norm. And that's part of what axiochemistry is. All right? So the effect of those drugs on the human spirit, as well as looking at the study of a particular culture's drug technology, including the uses which make up that particular culture's pharmacology, drug laws, and standard healthcare praxis. Now, praxis is simply where theory and practice intersect. So praxis is simply the plural of praxis. The actual English word, look it up, not the Klingon moon. And of course, how problems start and how to heal them. So what I'm pointing out is that each ethnic culture that has a genetic and cultural history older than Western civilization and has a drug technology has healthy, non-addictive attitudes and policies as part of their science. So as an example, we got 800 different herbs from Native American culture, of which 80 are still in use today. So for example, foxglove digitalis. You have oil on the surface of the ground in Oklahoma, petroleum jelly. White willow bark, salicylic acid, aspirin, golden seal, echinacea, etc. All those came to us from Native Americans, as well as the European cultures that had herbal drug technology. So axiochemistry is basically saying, look, anybody that is a civilization older than 1,000 years probably has a drug technology. They do. Now, some of those healthy drug-taking behaviors were interrupted or destroyed by America, and then an addictive norm put in place. So, how problems start and how to heal them. So this originated as a mimetic amplification of Dr. Edwin Nichols, a black psychiatrist, industrial psychologist, construct of axiology, and Peter Bell, who is a black 12-stepper, kind of conservative Republican, a consultant to Reagan and Bush 1 about addictions in the black community, and he developed a cross-cultural model. So I want you to know that within black social science, we don't develop science just for us. We develop science that is attempting to be applicable across all the lines of people that we may encounter. So essentially, I basically took these two separate models and integrated them in a new model I call axiochemistry. So developing this into a working praxis. So axiochemistry's first premise, the koan of culture. Now, a koan is like a classical Japanese teaching poem, and the idea is this. So in terms of, before I get into that poem, the poem asks you certain things. So the first premise, what is the practitioner's culture? What is your culture as a practitioner? Who are you? Who are your people? How do you answer that question? Do you answer that question? Well, in axiochemistry, you have to answer that question because you have to know who you and your people are before you can help anybody else, culturally speaking. If you can't answer those questions, how do you expect anybody else, or how do you expect to be able to help anybody else? What is the client's culture? So the client might be an alcoholic, they might be a meth head, they might be a pothead, they might simply, be doing club drugs and into the electronic music scene. They might be a variety of things, or they might just be culturally identified or not. What is, though, the client's culture? What is the optimal praxis for that culture? Now, does that culture have an optimal praxis in terms of addiction behavior? May or may not. Another question you might ask is, where does culture reinforce and optimize health? Where does culture reinforce and optimize addiction? Which cultural artifacts that could actually be actual tools, could be actual concepts, which cultural artifacts are useful? And what cultural artifacts need to be created if they don't exist? And if a person's culture doesn't have the right healing technology, could healing technology from another culture be adapted for their culture? That's another question you could ask. And that's one of the questions that Hugh asks as part of La Cultura Cura. So he's basically saying, as a Latino, basically you have to go to the part of native. So Latino culture is a combination of European, African, Native American, and a blend of all those in the New World that takes part of all those. And it also could be Asian as well, because all those four cultures basically contributed to being part of Latino, depending on where you were in the world. In terms of like America, in terms of ethnicity, the Americas, there are 130 million black people in Latin America, which is more black people than there are in America. So that's part of Latino culture, though we don't necessarily see that. Right? So what cultural artifacts? So the koana culture. What is the practitioner's culture? DSM-4 is wealthy white male doctors determining what is normal for everybody. It's essentially what DSM is. What is the client's culture if they're not a wealthy white male doctor? How does the diagnosis certainly apply to them, but how much of it does it apply to them? How closely does the client's culture come to what wealthy white male doctors consider normal? And what happened to the client? What did the client have to do to survive? What tools do they have to withstand and cope with what happened? Do they have a story to explain what happened? And that's often the problem that we have and that I faced as a practitioner of color trained in a white Western psychological model. There was nothing within that model to explain my experience or many of the clients' experiences that I encountered, even white people. So how does Western science explain school shooters? It can't. They try to. Oh, they're mentally ill. Really? They were normal before they did the shooting. What led them to the shooting? Oh, let's control guns. Let's not look at that. So what is the optimal praxis for that culture? Does that culture have its own science that works better than DSM-4, now 5 in a couple of months? Well, it might. So where does the client's culture reinforce and optimize health? Where does culture reinforce and optimize addiction? So which cultural artifacts, that is, beliefs, practices, skills, knowledge, are useful? Which cultural artifacts are useful? the cultural artifacts that are indigenous, that is internal to the culture, or adoptable or teachable by the culture. So if you understand that within culture, cultural insiders, they don't reveal all their secrets. Okay, women might talk about PMS, but they're not going to necessarily talk about PMS to men. Right? Even if you live with a woman, you might not get that. Oh, she might say it's that time of the month. Well, what does that mean? Or, she's pregnant, the pickles and ice cream thing, which is largely a myth, but there are some people that experience that. But women constitute a culture. That's long-standing. Women were discriminated against before rape. People were discriminated against by race. So there is a separate culture of survival. What do women know that men do not in terms of culture? So when we apply this to drug culture as an example, let's take the Irish. The Irish wise women who were herbalists and midwives and controlled the access to certain drug technologies. The drug that in Gaelic is called uisge, which we anglicize into whiskey, is made from grain. There is a rule in Ireland and Scotland today, generated by the wise women of Ireland and Scotland. This is pre-Christian. No one makes whiskey until everybody has bread first. Nobody makes whiskey until everybody has bread first. Who would make a rule like that, men or women? Kind of obvious, okay? So what happens with the drug technology if 9 million women holding the knowledge of the drug technology get burned at the stake as witches by another competing religion that wipes them out? What happens to the drug technology? You start giving rum to 4-year-olds, which is a practice that did not happen in Irish and Scottish culture before the cultural genocide of the English. So then what happens is you have, with no cultural breaks, you have widespread addiction to cover up the genocide. Now, in order to talk about this, as a person of color who survived genocide and slavery, etc., it's instantly relatable. Natives can see this, and many people who identify as Irish and Scots, if they look back in their history, they go, wow, right. That's deep. Well, what happened to the Germans? What happened to the Russians? You can basically look at, was there genocide and all that kind of stuff, and did that lead to healthy drug use patterns or not? So part of the idea is so that was a cultural value within Irish and Scottish culture that kept addiction down, that once that was destroyed, addiction went up. And now we have the stereotype, just like we have the stereotype of drunken Indians. So understand, the Indians' drug habits were imposed upon them as part of cultural destruction. Same thing with the Irish, same thing with the Chinese and opium, etc., etc. Same thing with black people in liquor stores and crack, etc. All right? So, what cultural artifacts need to be created? So you saw on the first day when I talked about addiction to slavery, that came out of the black community. You saw the billboard basically came from somewhere back east. Addiction to slavery, capitalism plus dope equals genocide. So sometimes new emerging problems have never been faced before by a culture. So you have to create new ones. All right? So the koan of culture goes like this. So this koan of culture is in the form of a haiku. A haiku is a form of Japanese classical poetry in which you have 17 syllables in 3 lines. Now, I've kind of violated the form, but I've stuck with the 17 syllables. So here it goes. Culture causes cures. Violence, sickness, disease, deaths, all must find their peace. And peace is spelled with the I and the A emphasized because it is I who must find a piece, a healing piece of my culture, and piece by piece, like a puzzle, find peace and recover it. So the idea is culture, the koan of culture, is basically looking at the dimension of culture as part of the cure as well as the cause of addiction and related problems. So, for example, on the left of that, when you have powder drugs, you have needle drugs, you have a crack pipe, the medicine wheel construct here is being used as a symbol. This is internal to Native American culture, so within the symbol of the medicine wheel, even though not all Native cultures use the medicine wheel construct, basically you have on the right, you have 4 stages of life and 4 seasons. So child in the east, youth in the south, adults in the west, and elders in the north. You have 4 races: the yellow race of the east, the black race of the south, the red race of the west, and the white race of the north. You have different animal qualities. So eagle in the east, mouse in the south, bear in the west, and buffalo in the north. And qualities in terms of time of life: illumination in the east, innocence in the south, introspection in the west, wisdom of the north. Now, basically, within this indigenous construct is a unifying model that can be used one way to look at the part of the Wellbriety movement is basically looking at what are the healing aspects of Native culture within the Wellbriety movement in terms of native healings and Native responses to addiction. So I'm basically just using that as one symbolic model to look at that can be adapted simply because it's been published, but it was secret and held within the culture, and part of what happened in colonization is some of these constructs got out. Now, they do have some psychological relevance for people who are not Native because we've seen the explosion in interest in Native culture, some good, some bad, some healthy, some not authentic, some inauthentic. Just using that as a model, say the Wellbriety movement is certainly one such model used internally to Native American culture that has a different worldview than 12-step, and where they basically say the source of addiction is basically the loss of the Indian way, loss and destruction of the Indian way of life. And if we return to the pattern that was pre-contact in the 21st century, then we can use certain healing practices and rituals, which could include sweats and piercing and teepee meetings and other healing circle type of technologies. Some of those can be adapted. Some of those other folks will have to adapt their own. So culture is a vast pattern which shapes and is shaped by individuals. It determines policy, structures, education, the conversation, that is what you can and cannot talk about, the zeitgeist, that is the spirit of the times, and who becomes a hungry geist, or who has bodhicitta. So a hungry geist is literally a Buddhist term which means it's a hungry ghost. This is usually a person within the Buddhist framework who is dead but was gluttonous in their life, and they're trying to seek to have all the experiences that they used to have in life, and they're a glutton, and they could actually inhabit people or haunt people, or just like the same concept of a poltergeist out of German, a noisy ghost poltergeist, a hungry geist, a spirit that supports addiction. So bodhicitta within Buddhism, bodhicitta may be defined as the union of compassion and wisdom, Relative bodhicitta, which refers to a state of mind in which the practitioner works for the good of all beings as if it were his own. So, a hungry geist is a person who's in addiction. They're driven by a spirit of addiction. And the bodhicitta is basically a person who is working towards healing. They can be the same person in different evolutions. So now I've given you a model looking, hungry ghost came out of Buddhism and described a particular quality, which you can cure using meditation by watching the ceaseless craving and ceaseless desire. And bodhicitta, basically, developing compassion and wisdom. So, culture determines who can talk about what, when, and how, or even if it is a subject for polite, so to speak, society. So, there is a word out of the South Pacific called mokita. So, mokita is, they have a word for it. And there's a great book called They Have a Word for It. And mokita is one of those words. So, a mokita is a thing that everybody knows and nobody talks about. And in the cultures in the South Pacific that have this word, where everybody in the community knows this secret, it could actually be life-threatening to actually speak about the problem. If everybody knows what the mokita is and they can't refer to it directly, and then somebody just decides to refer to it directly, blood or fists may flow. So you have to, there are specific rituals for dealing with mokita. So in a mokita, for example, the reality of AIDS is in a single bar. Everybody knows about it, but nobody talks about it. So when can a mokita be disclosed publicly? When you have the language to discuss it, and not before. So for example, the field, as I talked about on the first day, the field could not talk about AIDS and STD prevention until AIDS was a recognized problem. And the phenomenon of STDs couldn't be discussed until you have a language for talking about sex comfortably. So we're doing that as Americans in English. But what do Latinos have in terms of doing AIDS prevention? We do AIDS prevention in Hispanic and Latino populations, but if you were raised in the Catholic Church, you were not raised for a model about talking about sex or contraception. It's supposed to be, against the teachings of the church. So that could be a problem with heterosexual transmission, which planet-wide is the dominant norm for spreading AIDS. In fact, globally, the spread of HIV is connected to where women have access to barrier methods. So it's mainly heterosexual transmission. It's only here where we first heard about the epidemic among gay men that we think it's a gay disease. Globally, it's a heterosexual disease. The virus doesn't care who's zooming who. The virus just wants to spread. But in terms of doing AIDS prevention, if you cannot talk about sex, you can't do AIDS prevention. If women do not have access to barrier methods like condoms, they can't do prevention. If a woman can't seek barrier methods on her own because her culture will not allow her to speak to a man or a woman outside of her family, prevention of AIDS becomes very difficult. Your culture has to have the ability to talk about a mokita without a life-threatening thing. All right? So part of the piece, a mokita can be disclosed publicly when you have the language to discuss it, and you have to be a cultural insider to be able to do that. If you're outside, they can dismiss you. If a cultural insider can find the way to bring up the problem. Right? Of course Obama got elected because he's not too dark and can talk good. Duh. right? That's a cultural framework. Now I'm throwing it back on race and said, look, the ability to talk about race is still a factor. We're not in a post-racial society. We're not, right? So race has health implications. Race and culture and gender and ethnicity. Different cultures deal with sexual orientation and sexual diversity. The science shows us human sexual diversity is a reality. Different cultures have different levels of comfort and different levels of conversation about sexual diversity and gender diversity. Who has access to treatment technology or prevention technology? All right? So, race is still a factor. Ray Charles could see that with Stevie Wonder's glasses. Ha ha ha, internal joke. Right? So, the trick is to see, within axiochemistry, how culture has shaped your own biases and correct your behavior for those biases as if they could be wrong. Now, the idea is, I'm not saying that your biases are wrong. I am just saying that in terms of the client, you want to have biases that go in the client's favor. So you want to display those and kind of hide the ones that you need to work on that could bias you against the client's recovery. So you have to know what those biases are in your uncomfortable places. You do. I do. I have had to. Right? Okay? Your constructs of what is normal may not, in fact, be healthy. They may not. And they may not be healthy for you, and they may not be healthy for your client. So you might not want to impose them. Okay? Sane and normal behavior might actually be addictive behavior in some contexts. Because if you grew up in an addictive norm and you don't know anything else, oh, well, that's sane. Okay? We have a saying among my people, it was so bad it got good to them. That is to say, their addictive pattern of living became normal to them. Okay? So let's take Cartwright. We have another few minutes. And one of the critics of people like Cartwright. So, Samuel Cartwright was a Confederate doctor. Confederate doctors did experiments on slaves without anesthesia, that is, actual cutting with scalpels, in medical experimentation because they didn't believe blacks were advanced enough on the evolutionary scale to feel pain. They felt that we were dumb animals. So, doctors, this was normal practice in and before the Civil War and during the Civil War to perform amputations without any anesthesia at all. In fact, if you're women, the doctor that developed the speculum used black slave women as experimental subjects using pewter spoons to develop the speculum, and he worked on them and inserted those things into their vagina and etc. without anesthesia, and they actually had to be held down by other doctors, and if the other doctors got squeamish, then by other slaves, while the doctor did his thing, sticking metal objects into their lady parts without anesthesia. I wish I was making this up, but no. So, Confederate doctors did that. This is a normal feature of the Confederacy, which is not a one-person, one-vote democracy based on gender, class, or racial equality like we theoretically have today. So, Samuel Cartwright. So, I'm bipolar. This is a part of one of my poems. I'm bipolar from Western civilization. So, Samuel Cartwright, my degree's in psychology. So, Samuel Cartwright, and so I'm bipolar between the poles of Samuel Cartwright and Franz Fanon. So, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the first black American PhDs from Harvard, described what he called a healthy black person has dual consciousness. They have to understand how to operate in the white world and in the black world simultaneously, and it's almost like it's schizophrenia. So his dual consciousness. Samuel Cartwright coined a term called drapetomania egypticus. And Franz Fanon coined a term called socio-structural violence. So I'm cycling between Western civilization, white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and something older. So if your education and training fail you and your clients is nothing left, so other people of the four directions have science as well. What does prevention, addiction, treatment, and recovery look like from another direction? That's basically what axiochemistry tries to do and develop. So, I'm a congenital drapetomaniac. So, Samuel Cartwright, he basically was a white Southern Confederate physician who coined maladies which afflicted runaway slaves. In other words, what he was saying is there was a belief at the time, and this is being still taught on campus as part of an American history class, that slavery improved black people. So, he believed that, and that slaves were crazy for running away from slavery. They were mentally ill for escaping slavery. That's what he believed. Now, why this is important is his mentor was Benjamin Rush, who, even though Benjamin Rush was abolitionist for the abolition of slavery, Cartwright had this construct that black people were crazy for escaping slavery. So the flight from home madness, a mental illness that caused slaves to run away from slavery. In other words, you were crazy to want to escape slavery. This is probably part of why APA refuses to, that's obviously racist, right? And if this is one of the founding fathers of psychology, then there's going to be a similar blindness around racism that exists and persists to this day. And also diaesthesia ethiopica, also known as rascality by overseers. Slaves destroyed property, avoided work, and raised disturbances with the overseers. So if you're making trouble, doing sabotage to get out of work, well, that's part of mental illness too. So this raises, when we talk about raising disturbing issues, so disturbing to who? His ideas were incorporated into what became the American Psychological Association. Cartwright felt that racism was a normal scientific fact. In fact, because it was a fact, there's nothing to be done about it. Blacks were permanently going to be inferior to whites. They were animals. That was his scientific belief and the beliefs of the time. That basically remained the psychological position of mainstream society well into the 20th century, if not today. So his observations and practices were based on that view. So APA committee basically felt that even though there have been black psychiatrists that have been trying to say, look, we need to look at racism. That committee felt that racism is so widespread, it has been normalized, thus you can't do anything about it. And it's not a pathology, and they've resisted pathologizing racism. Same thing with sexism or non-heterosexual gender expression. They remain to the degree that APA still refuses to recognize that there are symptoms of multi-generational trauma and PTSD or PSSD, that those even exist as a result of racism and systemic discrimination. Now, part of those issues and part of that science, this is the science that we're kind of left with, kind of wrestling with and resisting as part of our cultural work. So just to finish, Indigenous hybrid science. So this is from Eduardo Duran, who's who wrote a book called Native American Postcolonial Psychology in 1995. He says, and I quote, in effect, psychology is the enforcement branch of the secularized Judeo-Christian myth. Our discipline has been a co-conspirator in the devastation and control of those who are not subsumed under a white, male, heterosexual Christian subjectivity. That is to say, so he's a Native American clinical psychiatrist who was attempting to do healing and finding that his healing modality that he was trained under was inadequate for Native American populations. So he wrote a series of books, including Native American Post-Colonial Psychology, Healing the Soul Wound, and Buddha in Red Face, that are excellent works to begin to look at not only applying to Native American populations, but also other populations as well, including vets and PTSD. So Healing the Soul Wound is for that in particular. So when I'm saying indigenous hybrid science, there are bodies of work that look at this that you can explore on your own, and I'm just pointing you towards them. So we'll look at this a little bit more next time. Shta Yu, which in Chakcha means stay strong.